I was in a dive doing 350 miles an hour and encased in ice. We bank 90 degrees to the right. I say, I have the aircraft and I claim to take control of the aircraft, but really I'm just riding it to the scene of the crash.
That's Dan Manning, and what an incredible story that you're going to hear from him in just a moment. Welcome into the channel. My name is Tom, and I'm the founder of Vertical Motion, where we help good people become great leaders. Today, we are talking to someone that I met at Patriot Bootcamp, which is a program to help veteran entrepreneurs be successful in their businesses. Dan is the chief story architect and founder of Build the Story, where he helps founders, coaches, and consultants create short, impactful stories to sell themselves and their businesses. Prior to beginning this business, Dan was an Air Force officer, a fighter pilot, and a military diplomat. He led the day-to-day operations against ISIS from the Combined Air Operations Headquarters in Qatar. During that deployment, he was also the lead operational negotiator with Russian forces in Syria. In his storytelling work, he examines how stories shape our beliefs and behaviors. I am so excited to welcome to the channel Mr. Dan Manning. Dan, welcome to the channel.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So let's just kind of go through a little bit of your background first and tell me a little bit about your time in the military, which I just kind of briefly mentioned, and then how you went from that to this line of work.
Yeah, so I spent 25 years in the Air Force. The first half of that time, as a fighter pilot flying the A-10. The second half as a military diplomat. I was the defense attaché in Kyrgyzstan, so I learned Russian for that assignment. And then I was also a speechwriter, writing for the Undersecretary of the Air Force. I wrote sometimes for the just I think once for the chief and once for the secretary as well, but working at the very high levels of the Air Force and Air Force leadership. And then I spent the time in Qatar, right? So where I was leading the day-to-day air operations. Like as operations were going, I was sitting in the battle cab above the floor making decisions and then talking with the Russians, ensuring that we weren't bombing each other if that was not the thing that we intended to do. But you can only do that type of work for so long. So I retired from the Air Force in 2019 and I started working primarily helping to teach creativity, critical thinking, and communication skills to founders. But just over 3 years ago, I focused pretty much exclusively on storytelling and helping people to use stories to communicate.
It's fantastic. So you've been telling stories for a while now. So part of that was your job as a speechwriter to help craft the story, craft the narrative. And we're going to get into the value of storytelling in a moment. But when you and I met, I met when you were speaking at Patriot Bootcamp, and you gave a really great presentation, starting with a story that you used to illustrate the point of how valuable stories are and how stories allow people to remember things. I was wondering if you'd be willing to reshare that story here.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the story that I tell there, and the one that I tell in to kick off workshops, is that I've been telling stories for a long time. But there was one moment when the power of story became undeniable to me. And in that moment, I was in a dive doing 350 miles an hour and encased in ice. So even before I was an A-10 pilot, my very first assignment after pilot training was to be a pilot training instructor. So I was flying out of Wichita Falls, Texas at Shepherd Air Force Base, teaching the brand new pilots how to fly. We were flying in a very small airplane. It's a T-37. It's essentially a Volkswagen Beetle with wings. And if you know literally anything about Texas, you know they do things big. And one of the things they do big are thunderstorms. And on this particular day, a massive thunderstorm had built up between where we were and home. So there's no way that we're going to fly close to that thunderstorm with our tiny little airplane. So as we were trying to get towards home, we flew further and further west to avoid the big, ugly, black, dangerous cloud. But eventually, we had flown so far to the west that if we didn't turn and start pointing towards home, we weren't going to have the fuel to make it there. So I told my student, now I only had probably less than 100 hours of instructor time. I was still very, very young as an instructor. And I said, all right, we're not going to get close to that big black cloud, but see those white puffy clouds, the ones that are building up close to it. These are the kind of clouds that if you're a kid on the ground, you might look up and say, hey, look at that cloud over there. It looks like Goofy wearing a sombrero. Like we're going to fly into that cloud. And we know that if it gets bumpy, all we have to do is, turn left. We'll point back to the west. There's clear airspace to the west and we'll be fine. So yes, sir, let's do it. So we turn, we fly into the cloud, and instantly it gets incredibly bumpy. We bank 90 degrees to the right. I say, I have the aircraft and I claim to take control of the aircraft, but really I'm just riding it to the scene of the crash because I try to get us back to level flight. And as soon as I do, we bank now 90 degrees in the other direction. Every time that we're banking 90 degrees from one side to the other, the nose is falling steeper and steeper. And the airspeed's continuing to pick up. And I'm looking at the instruments. I'm trying to use the instruments to recover. But every time I think that I have it, we get flipped back to the other side. And their airspeed is now starting to really pick up. Even through my earplugs and through my helmet and through the canopy, I can hear the wind noise getting louder and louder outside. On the windscreen, there's a sheet of ice that forms, and then almost instantly it breaks off, and another sheet forms immediately back in its place. And in this little airplane, there's a light that comes on when your engine intakes are beginning to fill with ice. And that light was glowing bright orange. I was doing everything that I could do to try to recover the aircraft, but nothing that I was doing was working. But then I remembered something. And what I remembered was a story. It was a story that a friend of mine had told me just, a week prior about him flying his aircraft off the coast of Florida when he was struck by lightning at night, and it interfered with his instruments, and he said that he was scared. He wasn't sure what to do and how to recover the aircraft, but what he did was he took a deep breath. He picked an altitude where if he were not in control of the aircraft by that altitude, he would eject, and then he spent the rest of the time working the problem. So I did the same thing. I just took a deep breath. I picked an altitude where if I weren't back in control of the airplane, we would get out of it. And then I started working the problem. About 2,000 feet prior to that altitude, we popped out of the bottom of the cloud. And now I could look around. I didn't need the instruments anymore. I could see the horizon and was able to bring us back to level flight. So take that, Goofy. Right off of our nose was Fort Hood, Texas. Air traffic control asked if we would like to land there. I said, yes, I would love to. It's the first time on record anyone has been happy to land at Fort Hood, Texas. But we landed. We taxied in and we decided we would try it again another day. But on that day, I learned two important lessons. The first is stay away from Goofy. He's a jerk. But the second is that in the moment when I needed information the most, the thing that broke through to me wasn't a sortie that I had flown. It wasn't a simulator sortie that I had done. It wasn't something an instructor had taught me. It wasn't something from a book. It was a story. It was a story from a friend. I was able to learn from his experience without having to suffer his pain, but I could add his experience onto mine. And now I had that available to me just as if I had experienced something like that myself previously. That's the power of story, to connect people, to move ideas, and to allow someone else to learn from our experience without having to suffer our pain.
Absolutely amazing, Dan. I love this story because for two reasons. One is that the story itself is something that's hard to forget, but the point of the story is the value of storytelling, which is kind of meta if you think about it. It's
Mhm.
kind of like
It
a nested story within a story about stories. So this is something that, when you told this story for the first time, I knew I would never forget the story, and I still recall it very clearly. And hopefully our viewers and listeners will as well. Why do you think that is? What is the reason that storytelling is so valuable, so important?
So there's a few reasons. One of them is biological, right? The way that our brains receive story is very different from the way that we receive facts. When you tell a story, now you have to actually tell a story, right? It's a complete narrative about a character who transforms on the way to reaching a goal. Human brains react differently. There's a great TED talk by JP Phillips is his name. He calls it the angel's cocktail. And these are the brain chemicals that get released in storytelling. One of those brain chemicals is cortisol. And cortisol is typically this stress hormone. But from an evolutionary perspective, when we're exposed to cortisol, our memory capacity increases. And it makes sense, right? If something is causing us stress, we would like to be able to remember, oh, here's what happened just before that stress occurred. So I can stay away from the place where the snakes are, or the tiger is, or whatever those things are that are threatening. But when I tell a story, I can create that cortisol in your brain. While I'm in that dive, while I'm trying to recover, your brain is simulating those things that I'm saying. You're imagining it. And our brains are not the best at separating what we've imagined from what's real. I don't know if you've ever woken up from a dream and maybe later in the day you're like, did that really happen, or was that something just in my dream? Our brains aren't very good at separating those two. So as your brain is simulating it, you're getting that cortisol and it's cementing that story into your mind. And the second thing that happens is just from a contextual perspective. You have this vivid experience in your mind, but it also shows up with context. My message shows up with context. My message shows up with a way to attach to something in your brain. So it's just easier to hold on to, and you're able to recall it when you need it, even if you're not purposely saying, oh, let me think about what that story was. You get into this situation where you don't know what to do, and your brain indexes what to do in these difficult situations. And maybe you take a deep breath and you make some fail-safe plan, and then you try to work out and figure out what's going on and how to do the best that you can do in the situation you're in.
Yeah, I love the psychology of this, that the way that humans record information and learn really is through storytelling. And that well, actually, there's really two ways that humans learn the best. And one is through experience, and the second is through stories. And I find that that's because people can relate to the stories as if they were there, just like you're talking about. The psychology and the physiology that you just described is what's happening when people are hearing a story. It's a very similar experience in the brain to actually experiencing the moment themselves. And so I can imagine myself in that cockpit staring at that bright orange light. I can see the goofy with sombrero cloud that
Mhm.
you're aiming towards that turns out to be the wrong cloud to go into. And so that's like really powerful. That one of the things that you said was that the story is the truck and then the message is the cargo. Could you dive in a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes when people are talking about storytelling, or people who are, sort of a storytelling coach or a storytelling consultant doing some of the work that I do, they focus on telling a great story. And telling a great story is exactly what the mission is. If you are building entertainment, right? If you're writing a novel, if you are writing a screenplay, a great story is what you're trying to do. But in real life, especially as an executive or as a leader, I'm not trying to entertain the people that I'm leading or that I'm communicating with. I want them to get my message, right? Message is the cargo and story is the truck that carries it there. I want to wrap my message inside of a story so that I can take advantage of all those brain chemicals and all of that visualization that happens when we're sharing stories. So I can get the advantage of all those things. If I don't tell a story, those things don't happen in my audience's brain. So I want to make sure that I tell a story because it's effective, but the story isn't the main event. The main event is my message, and everything that I do should serve that message so that it's as easy as possible for my audience to receive it. I care more about my message than they do. So I want to make it so easy for them to receive that they can't miss it. And when I do that, I get the benefit of them understanding the thing that I'm sharing with them, and I don't have to worry so much about, well, did they get it? Did they understand it? Because I've made it so simple for their brain to receive that it's almost impossible to miss.
That's amazing. I love that. We teach that communication is one of the most important skills that an executive or a leader can learn because at the end of the day, your role as a leader is to influence others in some way or another. And why limit yourself to just telling facts when it's been proven scientifically that that doesn't work as well in getting the message across as telling a story does? And so you work a lot with entrepreneurs, with executive leaders. Tell me a little bit about how do leaders and executives, how can they use the storytelling ability to help them in their career, in their job, in the roles that they have, especially with entrepreneurs having to convince investors and customers to believe in their thing that may not be completely built yet?
Well, I'll say that there is a limitation. It only helps them if they're talking to humans.
Mm.
Right? Like humans receive stories, but all of us talk to humans, right? We talk to humans, whether they're investors, whether they're customers, whether they're our boss at work, whether they're the people that we are leading. We are a communal species, right? We have to have other people that we communicate with. So if you are a founder, you're pitching to an investor, for instance, you need this investor to believe a few things. Right. You need the investor to believe that the company that you're pitching can be a massive company. You need them to believe that you are the person to do it. But you're speaking not from fact, right? You're not already a massive company. You don't already have a million ARR that you're talking about. You need to create this vision in their mind that is the vision that you have in yours. And the most effective way to do that is through story. When people are pitching, typically what I'll do is I'll give them a very short story that they can tell at the beginning of their pitch. And it's usually a story of their ideal customer using their product to get the ideal result, because this frames everything for the rest of the pitch to that investor. Often you've been to, tons of startup events, people will pitch, they get to the end of their pitch and the first question from investors is, so what are you doing? Like they just spend 5 minutes going through their business and no one in the room, maybe not even the founder themselves, understands what their business is. But if you give them this contextual story at the beginning, now they can do something with all that other information that you're giving. But the same thing happens for executives in interviews, for after you have the job, when you're pitching your new idea to your boss, when you're asking for more headcount, when you're asking for more budget, when you're asking for some new initiative. You need your audience to understand what it is that you're talking about And wrapping it in a story is just the way that humans communicate.
And I love that, we went into a much deeper dive inside of the Executive Career Accelerator community that we have. And you gave an amazing presentation with a ton of detail there. And I appreciate that. We were talking a little bit about the value of storytelling on LinkedIn. And one of the things that we teach on this channel is that you have to build your executive brand externally out there in the world, even if you're trying to get an internal promotion. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the value of storytelling. Is that something that even makes sense to still tell stories on LinkedIn as opposed to, just writing something that's fact based?
100%, right? There's a billion people on LinkedIn. The only thing that we all agree on is that we don't want to be pitched. Nobody wants to go to LinkedIn to get an ad from anybody about anything. So what I see often is in people's content, there often people talk about it as the hook, right? But those first opening lines, as soon as you read those 2 lines, I think now it's 3 lines on some versions of LinkedIn, but you see those lines, and for most people, most people's content either see the beginning of an ad where somebody's going to tell you to buy my thing, or you see the beginning of a lecture where somebody is telling you, here's what you should do, or here's
Mm.
this platitude, and here's the lesson that we're going to attach to it. Your close friends, your super fans, they'll probably click on that and they'll read it because they know you and they interested in what Tom thinks about this thing. But for everyone else, they don't care. They don't care what you think about that thing. They do care about themselves, and they do care about the problem, about the pain that they are struggling with right now. So if I lead my LinkedIn post by indicating that there's going to be a story here, that as I use some I, me, or my language, that is far more likely to get people to click the more and now start to read my post. Often I have people who, I meet with on a Zoom call or whatever, and they're like, I can't believe that I read your whole post. But it's the story that brings them through from step to step to step because they want to find out what happened, because they need sort of this closure that is built inside the story. But it's not just this random story that I'm telling. I have tuned that story to my audience, to the people that I'm trying to reach, because I want to figure out what they are already interested in. And I want to attach what I want to say to something they are already interested in. And that is what's going to bring them through and allow me to drive my story truck up and unload the message into their brain.
That's amazing, and then I get the sense that what you do primarily is you help people understand how to put those stories together in the right way so that you are crafting the story so that it does deliver the message to the right audience in the right way and help them kind of understand how they can use stories from their life to kind of deliver the message that you're trying to deliver to others.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not an artful storyteller, right? If people ask like what my storytelling style is, I say that it's brutalist. I want it to be so clear. I want my message to be so clear that my audience can't miss it. So I have one structure that I use in every story that I create. And I've done about 800 stories over the past 3 years for people all around the world, whether it's on LinkedIn, whether it's in a pitch, on TED stages, in interviews, huge variety of places where people are using these stories. But there's one structure, and there's one structure because it's the easiest one for our audience to receive. And if you do nothing except use that structure, your stories are going to be more effective, like instantly, not in a month, not in a year, but I'm saying instantly they're going to be better.
I love that. I have two last questions for you, Dan. The first question is, and this is a question I ask everyone who comes onto the show. What does good leadership look like to you?
So, I spent a career in the military, like 25 years. And the military is a engine that runs on people, and people need leaders. And honestly, I'll say that I sort of took leadership for granted for a lot of the time that I was in the Air Force, because you look around, you see people who are leading all the time. You see some leaders that aren't very good, but the vast majority of people in the military are good leaders because you begin that from a very early age. But after I retired and I started working with more corporate clients and advising executives and helping them to better communicate, I started to see how there is a lack of leadership in the corporate space, that people don't appreciate it the same way that those of us who have been in the military see it as just kind of the air we breathe. And that missing leadership is crushing. It's crushing to people who are working, it's crushing to the organization. I think the most valuable thing a leader can do is to set priorities. And part of, and sort of that's a subset to creating clarity, right? Creating clarity amid uncertainty, where somebody says, here's what we're going to focus on, here's what we're going to put our resources towards, and we're going to do this thing. Now, doing that thing effectively means you have to understand the people, you have to understand the physical or the material resources that you have to be able to do that. And you set priorities, you create clarity, and now you help people to be at their best.
I love that. And you're absolutely right about the feeling of being surrounded by leaders in the military and then coming into the civilian world and wondering why doesn't everyone else have that leadership just kind of baked into them. So, very powerful message there. Last question for you. How can folks find you if they want to learn more about what you do or potentially get some help with their storytelling ability?
The best way is on LinkedIn. I post about storytelling several times a week on LinkedIn. I'm always available in the DMs. There's a link that you can use to set up, and I can give you some quick tips on your story right there. And that's really where most of my content goes, and most of my connections with people start on LinkedIn.
Okay, and we will include a link to your LinkedIn profile and your website in the show notes for this episode. So,
Awesome.
once again, Dan Manning, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate the story that you shared with us and all of the insight and wisdom that you brought to the table. And I firmly believe that storytelling is one of the most important skills that an executive or a leader can have. And it's certainly probably the most important communication skill that you can have. So, I appreciate the work that you do and appreciate you being on the show.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
All right. See you soon.